This session before lunch is entitled Integrating Knowledge to Influence Public Policy. Now, the session is described as saying that there are many strategies for integrating knowledge to influence policy, but which ones are likely to be the most effective, and does context matter? Very interesting following Lars and the panel this morning. What skills do knowledge producers, that's academics and others, need to develop to enable them to explain clearly to policymakers what their findings mean in practical terms for policy development? In turn, what skills do public policy makers need to develop to understand the meaning of research outcomes and how these can be integrated into public policy? Most importantly, how do we use knowledge to address wicked problems, those which are complex and often polarised views and include climate change, environmental issues and increasing demands on health care? Or is academic work destined to be lost in translation? The session chair for this session is Professor Rhian Parker, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Australian Primary Healthcare Research Institute at the ANU. She's also a most highly respected and honoured CHAS Secretary. Rhian is a sociologist by training with many years of teaching and researching in the area of primary healthcare. She's held academic positions at the University of Canberra, University of Melbourne, Monash University, and most recently was Director of the Health Pact Research Centre at the University of Canberra. She's been involved in a number of research projects as Chief Investigator, and she holds honorary appointments at the University of Melbourne and the University of Canberra. Please welcome Rhian.
Thank you, Jules. I do happen to work for a research institute which is supposed to be at the heart of this area of knowledge exchange and translation, and I could tell you a lot of stories about successes and probably more failures really, but I won't. We have a distinguished panel here today from a range of disciplines and organisations, and before introducing them, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some of the terminology that is used to describe this area. If you look at the literature, the terminology varies from knowledge exchange, which is about sharing knowledge across disciplines or across boundaries of policy and academia. Knowledge transfer, which is a bit like, some people transferring their knowledge into another pot. Knowledge translation, which at the moment is probably the term in health anyway that is most favoured. Knowledge brokerage is the other term, and there are knowledge brokers. We currently have a knowledge broker in our institute who's on secondment from the Department of Health and Ageing. He's an incredibly useful person who I run to and say, Peter, what does this actually mean? And he translates for me what it means, what the policy words are that I can understand. Some of those terms are kind of used interchangeably to describe the process of putting knowledge into action. It's also sometimes known as implementation science. Ideally, it's about linking what we know to what we do to get the best possible outcome. This could be in any area, as I said, health is in my area, the environment, education, and can link into policy decision-making, clinical care, and a host of other things. So that's what we, I think, are kind of talking about today, unless one of the panel decides to shoot me down in flames. What I'd like to do now is introduce each of the panellists, and they will then come and give a short presentation, and at the end we will have a discussion. So starting alphabetically from the top is Paul Harris. Now, Paul is Deputy Director of the HC Coombs Policy Forum at the Crawford School at the ANU. And he leads the Coombs Forum's policy research programme, Science, Technology and Public Policy. he's got very strong links with government and seems to hop from government to the ANU regularly, and has previously worked at CSIRO and for Senate committees at Parliament House. For those of you who read The Conversation, which is an online daily kind of, I wouldn't call it a newspaper, but if you don't, it's worth looking at. Paul is a contributor to The Conversation, and I found a couple of weeks ago through this august medium that he doesn't really like the term wicked, and I'm sure he'll mention that a bit later. Susan Goodwin teaches social policy at the University of Sydney, including a focus on gender and the welfare state and community capacity building policy and practice. She's worked with government and non-government organisations on, for instance, a study on gender equity, which is an area that's also close to my heart. She's held positions in non-government organisations, in the public sector, policy positions, and also at universities where she is now. Lawrence Pratchett, I know Lawrence because I eat a lot of dinners with Lawrence, anyway. Lawrence is Dean of Business and Government at the University of Canberra. And prior to this, he was Professor of Local Democracy and Head of the Department of Public Policy at De Montfort University in the UK. Lawrence has published widely in public administration, public participation and electronic democracy, amongst a whole range of other things. Julian Thomas is Director of the Swinburne Institute of Social Research and Professor of Media and Communications. Julian chairs the Management Committee of Australian Policy Online, and if you've not linked into that, that's a very useful tool as well that kind of arrives on your through your email, and I can't remember how regularly, but it's very useful. Julian chairs his research interests are media and communication policy, histories of new communication technology, intellectual property, and information policy. And last, but by no means least, at the very end over there, is Jackie Troy. Jackie's Director of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, or AIATSIS. Jakelin's research is diverse, but focuses on languages and linguistics, anthropology and visual arts. She's worked on major government initiatives in Indigenous affairs, including developing and writing the Native Title Act. She's also lived and studied in Mexico and Japan, where she developed an interest in the art and culture of those particular countries. Welcome to our panel, and as I said, starting alphabetically, each of them will give us a presentation, and there'll be time at the end for discussion and questions. Thank you.
Even though G comes before H.
That's all right. Oh, sorry.
All right. Good morning. Thanks for having me. I'll be alphabetical H, and then we'll have G. I think this is it's really interesting and a really important topic, the whole idea of the links between research and science and public policy. I've spent most of the last 10 years or so working at CSIRO at the interface of science and policy. And we, in CSIRO, we talk about integration a lot. And it's an idea that comes up a lot on both sides of the fence, in the research world and the policy world. And particularly when we're talking about addressing wicked problems, we talk a lot about the need to better integrate knowledge so that we can address these complex and difficult issues. But what I wanted to do this morning, just for 5 minutes or so, is maybe just stand back a little bit from that and ask, what is it that we're actually integrating? And how is that useful to better inform policy making through knowledge and through research and science and technology? And then I'd like to end by asking if perhaps it's possible to take this idea of integration a bit too far, and without wanting to give away my own argument. The Conversation article that Rhian mentioned I think it probably is, and we need to be on our guard a little bit against that. But I've spent the last couple of years seconded to the ANU, to the Public Policy School, working for the HC Coombs Policy Forum as part of the new Public Policy Institute. And we were specifically funded by the government to build on the skills of the university and create an institute which was really just focused on trying to strengthen the links between research and policy. And as part of that, I actually do get to spend a fair bit of my week putting on a suit and going into government. And when I say government, I mean the departments, the bureaucracy, but also going to talk to politicians and Parliament House, and actually just asking them what would be useful, what do they need, what are they grappling with. And I think it's kind of a rare privilege to get to do that. And in the research world, at least, we don't get to do that very often. And we're lucky that there's a few of us in the policy forum who have that as a major part of our jobs. We get to kind of walk around the university and then go and walk around government and just talk to people and ask them, what are they doing, what would be useful. And I think there are a number of ways in which integrating knowledge would actually, if we could do it better, it would be useful to policy. And I just wanted to touch quickly on two of those. The first is integrating new knowledge and existing knowledge. And one of the things I think that we get a little bit preoccupied with, particularly in science, but I think in research more broadly, is this idea of new knowledge. It always has to be new knowledge. And in fact, quite often what people need when they're trying to make decisions is a synthesis of already existing and new knowledge. And policymakers often say, we just need some help understanding kind of where we're at. What do we know? What don't we know? Where to from here? What's the kind of, they are interested in new knowledge and the cutting edge, but they need that put in context. And I think you see this a lot. There's a big focus at the moment. There's lots of people doing policy futures and foresight and all these kind of things. And if I can just give you a tiny little plug, in December at ANU we're running a workshop with our colleagues in the history department on history and policy, because I think quite often we forget the hindsight bit. We focus too much on the foresight bit. Foresight's really important, but quite often we need to know where we've come from and what we've tried before. And you need to bring those two things together. So that's integration, I think, and I think we could do a better job of that. As Lars said this morning, I think we also need to do a better job of integrating across disciplines. And when he was talking about science and technology in society, I think in the science community, at least in the time I've been at CSIRO, there's been a sort of a realisation more and more that if you care about impact in the real world from science and technology, you need to take into account things like institutions and interests and values and all these other things. And so I think you do see in the science world a bit of an attempt anyway to kind of think about integrating science with other disciplinary perspectives. But in government too, quite often people ask us for that. We had this conversation early on with the Prime Minister's Department where staff in the Prime Minister's Department said, what would be really handy is if you just took an issue and you gave us all the different disciplinary perspectives on that same issue, and then you had someone who could kind of synthesise that and pull out some key themes and ideas. So I think that idea of integrating across disciplines is really important too. And I guess on both those different kinds of integration, the thing that strikes me is that no one really has that as a job. I think actually probably more people in government do than in the research world. But in government, I've been sitting in the Department of Innovation for the last 2 months working on science policy, and we keep reminding ourselves that science policy, it's not like running the economy or the health system, it's science policy. It's 2% of government spending or whatever. But even in our science policy team, we are just swamped. We are run off our feet. There's not enough time. There's not enough time to read. So people in government do this job of synthesising and integrating different kinds of knowledge from different sources. But I still think there's a need to do that better. But one of the challenges we face, to be quite honest, in the Public Policy Institute is that we go and talk to people in government and we say, what do you need? And we come back to the university, and quite often we find it really hard to find people to do the work that government has asked for. And it's not because people don't want to do it, but it's because no one's going to get rewarded for doing that. And in fact, there's all these other pressures on people to be publishing in top journals and all this kind of stuff. So I do think we have a bit of a problem in terms of kind of following through in some of these areas where I think integration would be useful, just in the simple sense that it's, no one really has that as a full-time job. If I can, I'd just like to end by highlighting what I see as a bit of a problem in taking the idea of integration too far. And we talk about this a lot. We used to talk about it in CSIRO too, that if we could only integrate all this science, if we could bring together agricultural science and climate science and energy and all these other kinds of scientific knowledge, then we'd be able to provide integrated advice to policymakers that would help them deal with wicked problems. And I think the danger with this is that there's an underlying sense here that you can kind of integrate away the wickedness, or you can integrate away the politics. And I was reading an article by the former UK Minister David Blunkett, I think is his name, the other day, and he was writing about a survey in which British people were asked, if you could get rid of the politicians and replace them with just professional experts, would you do it? And half the people who were polled said they would. And Blunkett was sort of saying, it's 50 years since Bernard Crick's In Defence of Politics. I think it's time for a new In Defence of Politics. And I think he's right, and I think there's a few people saying the same thing. To go back to what Lars was saying earlier, I think it's the linear model all over again, right? It's if we could just have more facts and more knowledge and we could integrate it properly, then we could get rid of the irrationality of politics and it could be purely rational and lovely and wonderful. To me, it's a little bit creepy if you take that to its logical conclusion. And our language, I think, betrays us a little bit when we talk about wicked problems. And you hear people a lot talking about the pathologies of the policy process. And I think our words betray us a little bit there. And I think that idea that you can integrate away politics and values is at best sort of naive and unrealistic. And at worst, I think, profoundly undemocratic. I think, again, this is by no means an original idea, but I think it's important to keep reminding ourselves that politics isn't irrational. It's the way we get things done in a pluralistic society. And Roger Pielke, who's written a lot about the relationship between science and policy and politics, makes this point all the time. And again, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the ancient Greeks knew that complexity and uncertainty and values conflict wasn't something that you could just manage away. You had to live with it. And it was actually a great act of hubris to think that through knowledge and technology you could kind of transcend plurality. And so I think we just need to be on our guard a little bit against kind of integration taken all the way to its logical endpoint. So I would say, yes, focus on ways in which we can integrate better to better inform public policy. But if I could just make a plea, following on from Lars's plea that we stop talking about evidence-based policy, I'd like to start a little movement to say that we should stop calling them wicked problems. They're not wicked. They're exactly the things we should be focusing on. And I think, you even see climate change now referred to as a super wicked problem. And then you have climate scientists saying we should suspend democracy because democracies can't deal with the challenge of climate change. To me, suspending democracy is scarier than climate change. They're both scary, but so I would just like to make a bit of a plea for integration, but not taking it too far. Thanks.
Thank you. And because of my alphabetical illiteracy, we'll now welcome Susan Goodwin. Should you change your name to something before?
Julian. So I have a little colour and movement. In my area is social policy, so I'm going to focus mainly talking around social policy, but hopefully the points I make are relevant and applicable to many areas of public policy. Now, governments and communities in Australia and internationally recognise that addressing significant public issues really requires the collaboration, cooperation and commitment of people across all sectors of society. And this recognition is sometimes talked about in terms of joined-up governance or network governance. It's somewhat strange, I think, and somewhat surprising that running alongside these ideas in public policy are models of public policy knowledge production which actually downplay the values of cooperation, collaboration, conviction, and commitment. So today, I'd like to argue for the reassertion of consumer, community, and truly public knowledges in the policy process. So, I've got to do something. That one? Said I had colour and movement, I lied. Okay, this is the evidence-based hierarchy of knowledge for policy that has already been referred to today. A key idea in this hierarchy is that authoritative knowledge can only be produced by methods modelled on the natural sciences. And what I want to draw your attention to is what is at the base of this pyramid: expert opinion. So this is at the bottom of the pyramid, which includes information from consumers and those who work closely with them. Now, what I've done is inverted this pyramid and have also focused not so much on the research methods used for gathering evidence, but on the inputs for evidence, putting citizen and consumer knowledges at the top and going down. Now, this is kind of a daggy, old-fashioned model of knowledge production for policy, but I think it's worth revisiting. This model was championed by social movements, including the public administration movements in the 1970s and 1980s, who called for the democratisation of policy processes. This model went out of fashion with the emergence of public choice discourses, new public management, and most recently, evidence-based policy discourses. But I think that this, in fact, is the model that best fits with that other governmental objective of joined-up or network governance, and is the best model for addressing serious social issues. So turning first to the significance and importance of advocate knowledge. In 2010 and 11, my colleague Ruth Phillips and I conducted a research project on non-government organisation knowledge production for policy. As academics, what we found was that more and more of the material that we were drawing on in the area of social policy was actually being produced not by universities, not by government agencies, but was being produced in the NGOs. In interviews with policy researchers in over 50 human service organisations across Australia, two themes dominated their arguments that policy research produced by human service NGOs is important. Firstly, NGOs were seen to be in touch with clients and have the ability to bring clients' voices to the table. And all of the participants referred to the uniqueness of this position. And many compared it favourably to university research, which was considered distant and quite pejoratively too academic. And the second theme was that NGO policy research is important for social policy knowledge production because governments listen to NGOs. Some participants related the NGO's extended influence to the expansion of the sector in human service delivery. And some recognised that as governments had moved out of service provision, it had also lost much of its policy research capacity. However, the NGO researchers themselves raised questions about the democratic steering of policy, noting that in a competitive, contracted out environment, NGO policy research has the potential to become self-interested. In other words, to become like private research or like research produced by private organisations. This is problematic for them. They also raised questions about the tendency for NGOs to speak on behalf or to speak for disadvantaged citizens. So I turn now to a really outdated model, which is a citizen participation model. Now, the 3 slides that follow give examples of using action research as the knowledge base for public policy development that we're developing in an Australian Research Council funded project conducted in 2 housing estates. The project's called Working from the Ground Up. Now, this slide shows the process of integrating children and young people's knowledge of their local neighbourhoods in policy development. We started by asking adult residents what they'd like to see changed, and the standout issues, as in many housing estates, was the behaviour of young people and the lack of services for children. So we asked the children and the young people what they wanted to see changed, and this information is being integrated with the adult residents' views into local, state and state planning processes. But what I find really alarming about this process is the extent to which children and young people are routinely excluded from knowledge production processes, even in a social policy area like this, around neighbourhood renewal and community capacity building. Now, this slide describes the action research processes around people living with mental health issues in public housing. Again, providing support for people with complex needs in the community is one of those, I was going to say wicked problems, but I'll say is one of those naughty problems that governments struggle with. And in the estates that we're working in, residents were really concerned about people with mental health issues. So, one of our strategies here was to employ 2 residents living with mental health issues to, among other things, get consumer perspectives and to talk to government, to talk to other organisations and talk to the wider community about their needs. And in fact, in a couple of weeks' time, it's Mental Health Week, and 25 residents with mental health issues living in these communities have made a film about what it's like to live in public housing with mental health issues, and it's being shown at the Randwick Ritz. So policymakers and service providers initially found including these consumers in policy and program development quite alien terrain. But now I think they're finding positive ways of integrating the mental health consumers into their policy and planning processes. This final example from Working from the Ground Up is around another seemingly intractable policy problem, engaging Aboriginal tenants in housing policy development. Like most state housing authorities, Housing New South Wales has a long history of tenant participation mechanisms, none of which have been particularly successful. So here what we did was piloted the employment of an Aboriginal tenant participation worker, again from the local community, to trial ways of integrating Aboriginal knowledge into the housing policy process. Again, the mechanisms championed by the worker were alien to policymakers. They kept asking us, why is the worker putting on community dinners? Why is the worker working with residents on a bush tucker garden? How is that going to feed into housing policy? The Aboriginal tenants now meet once a week in each other's homes. They're working on sending messages to housing. On small boomerangs, they write messages about what they like about housing policy. And on cut-out hands, they write what they don't like. As Maxine, the worker, explains, the hands tell housing, stop, we don't like this. Now, at a recent feedback session on Working from the Ground Up, a range of policymakers asked us how they could reproduce results like this in terms of integrating knowledge into policy. Our key point is that the solution is not to roll out a Messages to Housing program or a Randwick Ritz mental health show, but to make a serious commitment to cooperative, collaborative forms of knowledge production with citizens and for citizens. So, in conclusion, I finish with this quote: against the hierarchy of knowledge for policy that is currently dominant, and restate the importance of making a commitment to collaborative and cooperative knowledge production, policy development and service delivery. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That's a reminder to those of us who are obsessed with systematic reviews that there are other knowledges just as valuable out there. Lawrence Pratchett will be next. I've introduced Lawrence, and Lawrence will share his experience from the UK, I think, with us. Thanks, Lawrence.
Thanks, Rhian. It's nice to get back into some sort of alphabetical order, actually. I feel the world coming back into line at last. By way of context, I've only been in Australia for a little under 2 years, and before that I spent between 1997 and 2010 making lots and lots of money out of the new Labour government led by Tony Blair, who was committed to a approach to public policy of what matters is what works. So he and his government spent lots and lots of money with university departments, getting us to do research for them, and then blithely ignoring it and doing what they wanted to do anyway, but on the basis that they'd done the research and that they had academics backing it up where they needed to. And a couple of quick anecdotes from that. One is from a lawyer colleague of mine from University of Essex who was doing some research with us on e-voting and whether or not Britain could introduce e-voting. And he very confidently explained to the Blair government in a cabinet meeting how Britain could not have e-voting because it was against Article 3.1 of the European Convention on Human Rights, allowing free and fair voting. And he was very frustrated when the government had the temerity to argue, well, that's just one interpretation of the law, and we have other legal advice that says we can do something different. And he refused ever to have anything to do with government again, because if government couldn't listen to his opinion and his considered academic work, then government wasn't worth talking to. The other anecdote is actually Dave Miliband, who was Minister for Communities and Local Government for a short period under the Blair government. And I remember him speaking at a group of academics and said, you know, I'm so impressed by all of you because you can all criticise government policy so well. What would be really nice, though, is if just once you could actually move beyond that criticism and suggest to us what we might do that would actually work as opposed to what doesn't work. We know actually what doesn't work. We're quite experienced at that. Now, all of that is by way of sort of suggesting that there is a real big disconnect here between what we as academics do and what the politicians and policymakers need. And I take Paul's point that it's not just about politicians, it's also about a whole range of people within government departments and so on that are all trying to use this. And the Blair government got quite good at this. By the end of their period in office, a significant proportion of people that were commissioning research by university departments were actually academics themselves, who were far more rigorous in terms of the methodology they wanted than the academics that were doing the work. And that was quite frustrating for us when we thought we could slip stuff through underneath, and then they'd push us to work really hard in terms of the methodology. So I'm just going to say a couple of reasons why I think there is just this disconnect, and then I'm going to finish by saying what I think the outcome should therefore be, and I think you'll find it matches very closely with what Paul was saying before. The first challenge I think that we've got is an epistemological challenge, maybe even an ontological challenge between what constitutes knowledge. So academics have a particular interpretation of what constitutes knowledge which doesn't fit very comfortably with what policymakers need. I'm using policymakers here to mean anybody outside of the academic environment who is trying to shape policy, so government departments, politicians, even industry and so on. And that epistemological challenge amounts to the extent to which academics want to constitute knowledge in a particular way. They want to follow a particular methodology. They want to actually describe knowledge in ways, and I think what Sue was saying actually speaks very much to that you want to constitute knowledge in a different way from the way in which some policymakers want to do that. So there is a disconnect here immediately, and I don't think we can resolve that necessarily. I'm not sure I want to. Secondly, I think there's a teleological challenge. That is, do we actually agree on what the end goals are? In universities, we tend to be in pursuit of knowledge for the sake of being in the pursuit of it quite often, trying to find something distinctive, something different, whereas policymakers are trying to solve a specific problem, those so-called wicked or naughty problems. As an academic, I am interested in those, but I'm more interested in actually contributing to the general development of knowledge within my field, which in my instance is political science. And I'm actually interested in the theoretical contribution I'm making, which may not solve the wicked or naughty or difficult or complex problems which Australia's facing, which the world is facing in their own right. And I'm not that worried about that. I'm actually worried about getting my journal articles out and getting my ERA rating up and so on. So thinking about those sort of teleological challenges, what ends are we trying to produce? There's a disconnect again between those who are interested in solving the world's problems immediately and those of us who are just interested in pursuing knowledge for the sake of it. Then I think there's a temporal challenge. You'll notice I've used what I consider to be my best academic words so far: epistemology, ontology, teleology, temporality. The temporal challenge is one around the relationship between complexity and parsimony. Because as academics, we get to spend lots and lots of hours, maybe as a dean I don't, but I used to anyway, get to spend lots and lots of hours considering the use of words, considering the complex problems that I was trying to deal with, spending hours and hours and hours writing them, thinking about them, discussing them with other people. Policymakers have got to solve a problem fairly quickly. They're dealing with complex sets of information, complex competing arguments all the time. They need parsimony in what they're trying to do. They need a quick way of understanding what it is that we're trying to argue. And the challenge I think that we always have as academics is trying to communicate our complex and very, very nuanced arguments to policymakers who want the quick answer. They want that parsimonic answer. Now, I've talked about epistemology, teleology, temporality, and so on, because I wanted to make the fourth point, which is just the discourse challenge. That as a political scientist, I use language in a particular way to mean particular things, which the rest of the world doesn't seem to agree with. They seem to want to use words like democracy, institutions, in ways that I don't actually agree with. And I just want to spend all my time arguing with politicians when they use words like democracy, institutions, and so on, to say, no, that's not what it means. So there is a discourse disconnect here between policymakers and academics again, because we spend all our time worrying about these precise words we use, whether we use the word wicked problem to mean something or not. You know, that really matters to us. It doesn't matter to a policymaker. They just mean, what they mean is there's a problem here that we can't solve easily. Again, it's just it's a disconnect. And then I think there's a normative challenge. Normative challenge because it's really hard when we've spent our lives dedicated to understanding a particular theory, a particular problem, to avoid the idea that we're not bringing our own values, our own norms into the political world, that we're being dispassionate, objective academics who just have a view on climate change that is a theoretically and empirically informed view. To use the vernacular that British politicians use all the time, that's bollocks. The reality is that we all bring normative judgments into the academic world, just as we do, in my view anyway, just as we do as politicians. So we need to be conscious of that all the time when we're pushing a particular agenda. What does all this mean for what Paul was suggesting about the limits to linking academic and policy discussions? And my point of view is that we should not try to do that too much, that each should stick to their own. That doesn't mean to say that we don't talk to each other, but the role of policymakers is to make policy. The role of academics is to be academic. We try to meet each other in the middle at times, and we should make every effort to do that. But we shouldn't start to assume that we can somehow bring the two together and have some cosy, happy world in which everybody is speaking the same language, has the same goals, understands knowledge in the same way, and so on. We should try and actually stick to our own areas and understand the limits of what we can do in the other areas. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Rhian?
On a personal note, some of what Lawrence has talked about resonates with me, because sometimes when I go in to talk to people at government, I come out and I think I was talking Swahili and they were talking French, because I have no idea what actually happened. And I think there is that issue about discourse and language, and they are definitely under different pressures to us, because if the minister wants an answer in 2 hours, they want an answer in 2 hours. And we will explain that we can give them the answer if they give us $500,000 and 2 years to do the work. So that's part of the tension that we have. Next, in alphabetical order, is Julian Thomas. And Julian, would you like to come up here? Would you like to say? You come up here.
It is good to be in the right order. So thank you. So I think this area of this question of knowledge exchange and how we can talk about integrating knowledge to influence public policy. It's an area of real interest to me, and I think an area of innovation and some considerable challenges. I've been involved in a website that we mentioned a bit earlier, Australian Policy Online, for a number of years, and one of the things we have tried to do with that website is to, I wouldn't say integrate knowledge, I'll say a bit more about this later, but certainly to make knowledge more accessible for policymakers and for other purposes. So I think it's an interesting problem. I don't think it's a wicked problem, and on the scale of things, I think it's a relatively well-behaved problem. It's not going to go away just because we tell it to, but I think it's not evil. We can do things about it, and we have done a lot. And actually, I know academics and policymakers love to talk about wicked problems because it makes what we do sound so much more exciting, that we're in contact with wickedness, when in fact benign or slightly good problems are in some ways much better for us, because we actually can solve them or maybe do something about them if we're careful not to set the bar too high. And if all we're talking about is influencing public policy, I don't think it's too difficult. I guess thinking about some extraordinarily ambitious, complex attempts to integrate knowledge, to influence policy over the last decade or so, I think about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a rolling, massive international process that I'm sure you all know about. And I think in particular about some of the kind of obstacles that they've struck. And that debate that emerged after their 2010 report referenced a non-peer-reviewed claim that turned out not to be right, that was sourced from World Wildlife Fund reports that said that Himalayan glaciers were going to be melted by 2035. And this became a point of vulnerability for the entire IPCC work. It sparked an enormous debate, as I'm sure you all remember, and some really interesting comment, but became a kind of point of vulnerability for the entire report. It was extensively reviewed. I think it raises many issues, that whole episode, about how we use evidence, how we pull work together, about the status of peer-reviewed work and non-peer-reviewed work, this question that we've been talking about around the hierarchy of knowledge and the plurality of knowledge practices, and the way in which we use reviewed material in the research process. You'll probably recall that because of that problem in the IPCC report. It was exhaustively reviewed by an international group of science academies with a number of really interesting findings, I think, for our discussion. One of the findings was that they couldn't have done their work if they had been relying solely on peer-reviewed work. The reviewed scholarly publications in the field were not sufficient for a full study of the evidence of climate change. The review of the IPCC report also observed the way in which the report used what we sometimes call grey literature extensively. Technical reports, working papers, presentations, fact sheets, bulletins, all kinds of things, conference proceedings, that whole range of activity produced by a whole range of different organisations. Universities, of course, but also lots of government agencies, lots of public sector agencies of one kind or another, international organisations, research centres, NGOs, corporations, and so on. And I think what you're sort of seeing there when you look at the diversity of publications, as I said, what we call grey literature now, the diversity of those publications feeding into a process like that is a set of network knowledge practices that reflect the network governance that we were talking about earlier. The fact that these processes never belong to a single sector. They are invariably complicated. I think the IPCC episode points to a few really interesting issues for our problem of integrating knowledge. The extraordinary emergence of what I could call informal research publishing, I guess another way of naming grey literature. Informal research publishing enabled by a whole range of digital production and distribution technologies, many of them very inexpensive, that's completely changed the economy of publishing and distribution. We talked a little bit about what sort of skills do we need to communicate our research, and one of the main skills that you see in evidence is the skill of saving a document as a PDF, putting it on a website, and then making a publication in that way. So now we have millions of PDFs circulating around the internet, representing an extraordinary range of research methods, agendas, practices, and perspectives, all produced extraordinarily cheaply and easily. Obviously, informal research publishing, as I'm calling it, is also driven by the problems in traditional publishing, traditional academic publishing processes, the extraordinarily slow process of publishing research, new research through journals, the expense of journals, their inaccessibility. We could say a lot more about all those issues, but I think you're familiar with them. What's come out of that has been, as I'm saying, an extraordinary profusion of grey literature. And I think of importance for CHAS and our discipline sectors is that most of this is actually being produced in the social sciences. It's not coming so much out of the hard science areas. If you look at the various domains in which the IPCC worked, for example, and the different kinds of research that they drew upon across the different areas of their research, the areas where social science was involved were the areas where most of the grey literature appeared, despite that example of the Himalayan glaciers. So at one level, informal research publishing, grey literature, whatever we want to call it, is a wonderful thing. It's everywhere, and it's very, very easy and cheap to create. But it also generates all kinds of problems. Problems of accessibility, simply just hard to find. Problems of visibility, problems of preservation. These are fairly well known. But I think there are things that we can do about it. It's not so much about integrating knowledge, bringing all this grey literature together, a kind of synthetic process. It's more about breaking down some of that fragmentation that's come about because of the extraordinary profusion of grey literature. And I'd suggest an example of one platform for doing that is Australian Policy Online, which we've been working on for a number of years, which aggregates policy-oriented research from around 400 research centres in Australia in a very simple way, really. But it, I think, is interesting because it has found a way of bringing that vast amount of literature that's all over the internet into a fairly rough and ready mode of organisation, but has basically made it accessible in a way it wasn't before. So it now has about 17,000 subscribers to its weekly email newsletter. It's very much about what's new in research, so that email is what's really important. The site itself gets about 85,000 visits a month. And if you look at who the users of that website are, almost half of them are in government and almost 20% of them are in NGOs. So it's communicating research well beyond the academy. It's also, of course, communicating research that comes from beyond the academy. So I think it reflects that those network knowledge practices that we're now finding. So I guess my sense of the problem of integrating knowledge is that things like APO show the kind of the potential of innovation in this area, but I do think we need to almost completely rethink the way we publish academic work in order to make it more usable outside the universities. Thanks.
Thank you, Julian, for that. And I think it is hard. It's very difficult publishing, and it takes a very, very long time. And then it's stuck in journals, and even online journals are quite inaccessible to people who don't know what exactly they're looking for. And now, last but by no means least, is Jackie, and Jackie will give us her views about integrating knowledge and what knowledge is.
Thank you very much, Rhian, and to the other panellists. I've very much enjoyed listening to what you've had to say, and I now have the wicked problem of trying to keep my thoughts focused on what I was going to say, because I now have so much additional knowledge through my last 10, 15 minutes of research with your comments. So, and also before I begin, it is Aboriginal policy through 60,000 years worth of research that tells us that if we don't acknowledge the country on which we are standing and the people who are owned by that country, that terrible things could happen. So I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal Ngambri, who are owned by this country. We often talk about the traditional owners, but the reality is we don't own country, it owns us. I'd also like to acknowledge my own ancestors who are from the neighbouring Snowy Mountains, and I am owned by the Snowy Mountains as a Ngarigu person, and we used to, in the past, have visiting rights, if you like, so it was very good. I missed Auntie Agnes's welcome to country this morning, but I know that we're all well looked after because she's done that. So I speak to you today as an Aboriginal person, but also as a researcher. My trade certificate is a PhD in linguistics, and also as somebody who's worked for a long time in government in policy making. And I would suggest that actually one of the ways in which we can get around the difficulties that academics and policymakers have is for each of us to have secondments into each other's industries. And I know that rather than taking up a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University when I first graduated with my trade certificate in linguistics, I thought, no, I don't want to go and work for my people, and I worked for AIATSIS, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which was a bit of a baptism of fire. My first job was to be engaged with the government's response to Mabo No. 2. So suddenly all my people's rights, which had been denied for a couple of 100 years, were at my disposal to have direct policy influence on. And one of the first questions I was asked as someone who was trained in anthropology and as an Aboriginal person was, could I make a list of what our rights might be? And, I sort of babbled about collecting nuts and berries and the right to traverse country and blah, blah, blip, blip. And blow me down, some of that's still in the Native Title Act. But what I was able to say is that I thought that it was to be a process of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people discovering what our rights are through this new process, whatever it might be, and it turned out to be the Native Title Act of 1993. So I learned a lot. I learned how to brief ministers and write speeches for prime ministers. I learned how to integrate my research training, my trade certificate, with what public policy makers needed to be doing. I learnt to be quick and brief and to the point, as I babble on now, but I learnt to bring, 60,000 years and 250 different nations in this country. I think some speaker earlier said it's much easier to do business here because it's one government. Okay, well, you want to try being Aboriginal because there are actually at least 250 different groups. Each with knowledge systems and policy and practice and governance that I think could really inform the wider country if we were just listened to a little more frequently, as one of our previous speakers said. So, my notes for today began with a question, what is government policy if it's not based on evidence? And how can it be that research does not influence government policy? My experience is that all policy comes from some research somewhere. Sometimes it might take a long time for the results of research to influence policy development, but I would argue it is always there at the heart of all good policy. At the institution where I direct research, the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, we specialise in applied research. That is, focused on influencing government policy for the benefit of our peoples. This is not a recent phenomenon. To illustrate my point, I draw you back to 1979, when a top research archivist, Ros Fraser, from the Australian National Archives here in Canberra, had a research fellowship at AIATSIS. Her project was to collate all the information about records relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Australian National Archives. Her work led to the discovery of the records of Aboriginal children forcibly removed from their families between about 1930 and 1973 as part of the Commonwealth Government's assimilation policy, also based on research of, much earlier research obviously, and the associated programs that went with that assimilation policy. The rest is now history. A major government inquiry conducted by research academics produced the Bringing Them Home report. The stolen generations were revealed and their pathways home began. This small research project of Ros Fraser led to profound social and political change. It culminated in an apology to the stolen generations from the Commonwealth Government by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. Public policy and programs addressing the health and well-being issues of the stolen generations developed from that research and is still changing the lives of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. If public policy makers take the time to listen and understand what researchers can tell and show them, they will be able to make truly meaningful and useful policies. Another short story about my own research, my current, very applied research. I have the privilege at the moment of writing the National Australian Curriculum Framework for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. No mean feat, I have to say. Fortunately, I've got a lot of people supporting me who are advisors as well. But so I'm writing a curriculum that will work for all 250 of our languages and for the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority. This will be a guiding document that will enable all schools in Australia to provide all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students with the opportunity to learn their own and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. Our people will have our own voice, our own languages, I hope, from this project. As a national curriculum, it also means that all students in Australia, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or otherwise, will have a chance to learn one or more of our languages. This will lead, I believe, to greater joint understanding and empathy between Australians, reconciliation. I have only had this chance because policymakers from the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority have had the foresight to listen to me and understand my research and to share the vision for revitalisation of our 250 languages. And a last little point I'd like to make is that I had the fortune, I'm a bit kind of wobbly, I'm still flying, I'm afraid, but I've just done a kind of whirlwind tour of Taiwan, sponsored by Discourse, the government department which is sponsoring this event, as I understand it. So a colleague and I were, through the good office of that department, we had the opportunity to attend the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium in Rhian in Taiwan, in sort of mid-southern Taiwan. And our research horizons in the field of Indigenous education were further broadened through this exercise, and we are now part of an international movement to globalise Indigenous ways of teaching and learning, with a view to influencing education systems worldwide. Our research has been a long time in the doing, but our advice can be immediate and applicable for education policy makers right now, if they would like to listen. All it takes is listening and understanding. Give researchers a chance to interpret their work for those who will apply the research to policy making. I think that at this stage, that's really all I have to say, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today.
Well, thank you very much, all of the panel members, for those really interesting contributions. We have about 5 minutes for questions. So does anybody have a question they'd like to ask?
Did you say, why do academics never write newspaper articles? But they do. They do. I mean, academics have been a really key part of informed debate in the Australian press. You know, back 80 or 90 years, it's always something academics have done. Things like the conversation are fantastic innovations that I think extend that. You know, I think we really should see ourselves as having an obligation to participate in public forums like that.
Paul, I think you said earlier that no one's employed full time to integrate knowledge. Well, it's really integrators of knowledge. Do you reckon the politicians are in some ways?
Yeah, I do, and I think there are. I think that's what government does in a way, and Andrew and Gary were talking before about sort of trade-offs and bringing together different kind of evidence bases and having to make decisions, and in a way I think that's what democratic parliaments and governments are there for, and I think we as citizens sometimes reserve the right to expect them to deal with it all, but then be allowed to complain about whatever the decision is. But I guess a more specific point is that if I look at, we spend a lot of time kind of thinking about links between universities and the research community more broadly and people in government. And it is striking, I think, that where the funding goes is mostly to, research and government. And I think Lars made the point before that the processes for joining up those two things, that's a job, that's a profession, but it's not, I would argue that it's not funded as much as it could be, and it's not seen as a profession, it's seen as something that should just happen.
I'm interested in the particular public policy that I think hasn't succeeded very well in some respects, and that's around health and primary health, and that's your particular area. We have a bit of a revolution happening in the primary health care industry at the moment in Australia with the introduction of the seems to me to be that is a major disconnect that has frustrated me. I'm from the Social Work Association, and that every day my practice colleagues are confronted with health problems, wicked problems or whatever, that are determined by people's social circumstances and could be dealt with within that social circumstantial area. And yet, when there are budget cuts, you will always find it's the community health sector that gets the first cut. I just wonder whether you can comment on that as an example of perhaps the disconnect between those two areas, but also from your own perspective, perhaps.
Well, I could be here for an hour. I mean, I think there are a couple of things, and you'll have to excuse me for getting on my bandwagon. What we do really, really badly is deal with the social determinants of health. When we look at health promotion and prevention, it works very well for the kind of people that are in this room, because the kind of messages that go out, we understand. We can also afford the 5 pieces of fruit and vegetables that we're supposed to eat every day. But when people are in poverty and disadvantage, and we know that the burden of disease is there, they can't afford to eat, you know, and they're surviving. That's what they're doing. And they end up with chronic conditions and in the emergency department. So often they bypass primary health care. And in areas like Canberra, it's really quite difficult to access primary health care because we have a shortage of general practitioners. And you have to wait for a very long time. And you have to... often you have to pay. I think the other thing that comes to play here as well is the professions and the way the professions protect their patches. So over the last 10 years or so, nurses have been increasingly used to deliver primary health care, particularly in areas of medical workforce shortages. And every now and again, you get the fight from the AMA about, you know, that nurses should only do certain things and doctors do others. Now, we have really, really good evidence. You know, if you're talking about systematic reviews and randomised controlled trials, we have excellent evidence about how well nurses do, particularly in patient compliance and in communication with patients. But it's very hard to implement, you know, to utilise nurses to their full scope of practice if you've got another professional group that's against that. So, you know, with all the best policy in the world and with the best will in the world, often what happens is that other interest groups block the way, and government have to listen and be mindful of those other interest groups because they are very loud and you know, very vociferous. You know, the example here would be the walk-in clinic, for instance, that was set up, which is quite successful, but which has been fought against tooth and nail. Oh. One more question, sorry, off my box now.
Tangentially related to the question and the answer, but I haven't heard anything really about the relationship between knowledge and regulatory authorities such as the TGA and Food Standards Australia New Zealand. And that's, I mean, those regulatory authorities would ideally take, you know, would ideally depend utterly on you know, very carefully produced academic knowledge. But they take virtually no notice of it. In fact, they don't rely on it at all.
Right.
Now, it would be nice to see that addressed, the fact that there is no reliance and that there should be reliance, that, you know, there should be an actual structure that, that gives them a responsibility to rely on that sort of information. I'd like to hear anything that anyone's got to say on that.
Any comments from the panel on that? No.
I think you should go in alphabetical order here.
I don't know. It's not something I've looked at, but I would have thought that there is. I mean, I know in CSIRO there's a strong relationship between a bunch of CSIRO researchers and government regulatory agencies. I don't know how that plays out more broadly, but
That plays out as a commercial relationship, but I'm talking about regulatory.
yeah, I don't know. That'd be an interesting thing to look at. I think my sense is that regulatory agencies in the Australian government do have some strong relationships with research institutions, but I don't know.
Could you all now join me in thanking the panel for their work and their wise counsel?
Thank you, Rhian. Thank you, panel. Could you just stay there? We'll take some photographs for you. It's interesting to note that the title of that session was Integrating Knowledge to Influence Public Policy, and I think the most quotable quote that came out was from Jakelin. It said, "All it takes is listening and understanding."